Okay, so next, I was planning to present some work we've done here at the City Forum Lab Research Group on analyzing pedestrian movement in cities and how that interacts with urban design. It's a critical component, I think many of us would agree, that is of interest to urban designers, planners, architects alike, of what happens in between buildings, what sorts of human dynamics or the lack thereof, if it's different times of day, different reasons for that, like we saw from Eric during the pandemic in New York. And I think this question of pedestrian mobility and pedestrian behavior in public space has really relevance to urban design and planning across the board, from whether it's public health or decarbonization or social or even economic well-being. So broad interest around that. And it's been a topic that, at least amongst the designers, historically has been of great interest, like, for instance, illustrated here in a famous drawing by Louis Kahn in Philadelphia, the map that Brent showed yesterday as well. And folks who have written about this have argued typically that it's a really important quality of built environments that is something that we can feel and act on, but cannot necessarily describe or record. This is from Allison and Peter Smithson. Jane Jacobs famously referred to as the sidewalk ballet, very poetically, and describing what happened on her Hudson Street environment in Lower Manhattan, or Young Gale, Life Between Buildings. So in the research group here, we have been working on ways in which we can actually measure and record how built environments produce pedestrian dynamics between the buildings. And I'll briefly try to introduce the conceptual framework of how this is done, and then illustrate it with a case of some recent work we have been collaborating on with colleagues from the American University of Beirut. So in built environments, in these sorts of trip models, we typically think of trip origins, trip destinations, and paths that connect them. These can be, whether they're on the ground floor, they can also be three-dimensional, go indoors and outdoors of buildings. The likelihood of anybody to make a walking trip from an origin to destination really depends on the perception of travel cost, which is usually represented with distance or travel time. And as the distance or travel time increases, the likelihood of walking anywhere on foot decreases. But it also depends on the characteristics of the route. So if the route is unpleasant, or is perceived as unsafe, or is perceived as too hot or climatically inappropriate, then this likelihood really differs. And it depends on how we perceive the cost of the walking path. And that's something that can actually be represented. So climate goes into it, safety, quality, the quality of the ground floor interface, as Stephen was describing yesterday, or the facade, and so forth. And of course, different people perceive these qualities different. It's not universal for all. If you're a healthy adult, you're probably willing to walk pretty long distances, as we've oftentimes also seen from pedestrian surveys we've done in Boston and in other cities. And if you're an elderly person or a younger person or a person with different abilities to move physically, that likelihood of walking over distance and depending on the characteristics of the route really changes. Now, oftentimes people are also faced with alternative routes. They can walk not just one single way, but especially in dense urban settings where you have pretty dense street networks, along many different routes. And there's a process of route selection, which again depends on the qualities of the routes, and those can vary by person characteristics. But people, even on different days, can take different routes, something that models have to incorporate. Then the overall amount of foot traffic from the origin to destination obviously also depends on the size of the origin, how many people are there. If we're talking about residential origins, then bigger buildings obviously produce more trips than smaller buildings. And it depends on the characteristics of the destinations. The more attractive destinations pull more trips towards them, and the less attractive destinations, fewer trips. And if there's several destinations available, people make choices. If you talk about going to, for instance, go to a park, you may have 5 different parks within a reasonable walk shed. So there has to be some logic of how we analyze which parks people go to. Oftentimes that is modeled or analyzed based on how accessible the park is and how attractive a park is, which can be measured to some extent. And finally, it obviously also depends on the quality and availability of modal alternatives. So if it's really difficult to drive, so say that you are in central Paris and it's impossible to find parking, the traffic will keep you congested and stuck for an hour, oftentimes that's an incentive to not drive and to actually walk. But if you have a really fluid and amazing driving environment, even then, even if pedestrian conditions are impeccable, the alternatives might look even better and people will simply go for the better alternative. So they work obviously in combination or in comparison to each other. So all of these things affect the number of people walking between origins and destinations in a city. Travel costs, the choice of routes, the availability of alternative destinations, modal alternatives, and so forth. Now, what can urban designers do to affect this picture? First, what we can do is affect the friction of walking routes. So we saw that in several presentations yesterday and also today. Making routes more pleasant and safe and comfortable for people to walk will affect how many people will choose to walk in a city. And this is maybe demonstrated through many different real-world experiments of actually changing street, in this case, Herald Square in New York City, that entirely changes the pedestrian dynamics. What we can also do is change land use patterns in urban form and put more trip generators at places to increase foot traffic. So that's usually through processes of densification, new construction. And we can also affect the availability and quality of public destinations. So for instance, having this ground floor interface that also Stephen was talking about, having more active fronts where there are destinations, whether they're cultural or service or retail oriented, will create a more draw to the streets, will create more destinations that people may want to actually walk to. We've seen this pretty starkly transforming the Kendall Square area in the recent years. Right across the hotel that many of you are staying was a parking lot for many years. And it's just recently that's actually through very strong efforts on behalf of the city of Cambridge is to configure those ground floors so that they are actually active and full of destinations. So to represent this conceptual framework and to actually model it, we oftentimes work on this with spatial networks. We represent city environments as spatial networks. And it's a pretty scale-free approach from buildings all the way to metropolitan areas that can be represented. And there are software tools that we've worked out to actually do that. So there's a pretty widely used plugin for Rhino. It previously used to be a GIS plugin, and now most recently, Aziz has been developing an open source Python library for modeling pedestrian trips called Medina. So I'm going to use the remaining time to show a quick example of how in the research group, we've recently collaborated with our colleagues from Beirut, Lebanon, who are at the American University of Beirut and have been working on walkability in Beirut, especially in the post-2020 blast period, to improve pedestrian conditions. And we're applied some of this work together with them in this project. So quick context, Beirut witnessed one of the worst civil era explosions in history with a huge pile of ammonium blowing up in the port of Beirut. But that was not the only disaster. There was also, there's an ongoing economic crisis and compounded also by COVID-19. So many different things which basically made driving even more unaffordable to many and heightened the question of neighborhood quality and neighborhood streets as people need to get around. The study focused largely around the port of Beirut where the explosion occurred. The explosion is the number 6 dot. And MIT was invited through some Lebanese partners to work on community improvement projects after the blast. So we kind of teamed up with a team from American University to look at walkability improvements in these blast affected areas. So the the workflow included a pretty serious effort of data collection, because official data is sometimes hard to get, to building a pedestrian flow model for Beirut, and then using or participating in participatory design sessions at the American University of Beirut, representing improvement proposals that came from community members and stakeholders, and using that model then to try to illustrate how each of these urban design changes is likely going to shift foot traffic on the city streets in the study area. There was a survey of existing conditions of streets, largely done by the students and faculty at the American University of Beirut, that covered many of these areas around the port that were affected by the blast, and cataloged into different kinds of characteristics, and also sidewalks were mapped and sidewalk conditions were documented, resulting in different data sets on that. Now, one of the key methodological kind of ways in which these sorts of models can relate sidewalk conditions to models of foot traffic is from pedestrian route choice studies. When pedestrian route choice studies look at which way people choose to walk if presented with alternatives, then they can statistically actually explain what route features are more likely to compel people to use them. So typically we find that routes with more amenities on the sides, routes with wider sidewalks, routes with more greenery and street furniture are preferred by people, and routes that have more traffic noise, traffic volumes, more congested also people-wise, can be a discomfort and are not preferred by people. So from these route choice studies, it's possible to take their findings and some of their statistical coefficients and use them also in predictive models, that when we route or estimate trips, we do it according to the route choice coefficients, where we translate the impact of something like an additional amenity. So we've estimated, for instance, that passing one extra amenity, done it in different cities, is oftentimes perceived as an equivalent to the walk feeling like almost 2 meters shorter. So if you pass 10 amenities, it's like the walk feels 20 meters shorter. Okay, so we then estimate trips between various origins and various destinations at the address level resolution or precision, building to building, within Beirut, and route them through the pedestrian network, not assuming that people take the shortest path, but allowing them to take many different or any of the alternative paths that are up to a certain percent longer than the shortest path, and producing a kind of a representation of estimated foot traffic. For instance, this map here shows estimated foot traffic from homes to schools in the morning peak hour. So the origin points here are thousands of buildings that are homes. Destinations are schools, and there's a destination choice model. So we're not just assuming that people will only go to the nearest school, but we route trips to all the schools that are available along all the routes that are available, and depending on the route characteristics along the way. And so those schools that are closer, or those that have higher capacity or larger, tend to get a higher allocation than the other ones. This is another one, retail to retail trip. So this is from retailers, food service places, entertainment venues, and personal service places to other like places. And it's the sort of foot traffic estimate between them. Once there is a set of estimated pedestrian flows, these models are then usually calibrated on actual pedestrian counts. So we organized, as part of this project, or our colleagues in Beirut organized pedestrian counts at 90 locations throughout the city center, and on different days counted how many pedestrians were actually observed on city streets. This data is then used to calibrate the estimated model, so that the model estimates actually match the same levels of foot traffic that we observe during different times of the day and different days of the week on city streets. This is the model calibration. You can see, for instance, this is for the evening peak period during the weekdays, the kinds of pedestrian trips that really explain most of the variation in pedestrian counts are retail to retail or amenity to amenity trips, trips between homes and jobs, parks and businesses, homes and places of worship. And there were various day effects and other effects in these models. And this, once calibrated on the actual counts, produces a representation of foot traffic in the city across different trip types, not just one trip type, but a combination of different trip types with different likelihoods calibrated on the observed count. You may recognize that this is in some ways similar to this idea of cities historically doing traffic models for vehicles, right? We've had this for decades. Cities always do traffic models. They're called travel demand models. And this is very much indeed the ambition in these models is to provide the pedestrian the same gravitas when it comes to some of these conversations about streets getting investment and redesign. Oftentimes, the only people with any kind of information about trip volumes in the streets are the traffic engineers who will tell us that there's 1,000 cars on the street, so that street needs the investment for X amount of lanes. So we've very much tried to kind of provide similar kind of information about pedestrian dynamics or pedestrian flows that occur on city streets. And it's important to also give a face to what these numbers mean. So if you have a flow of 500 people per hour, what does that mean? This is a quick example of a time lapse of a street that has 300 people per hour. This is what a street looks like. That's actually Main Street around the corner from here. And here's a street with 1,000 people per hour. What that actually means on the ground, what it actually feels like to walk in these places on the ground. So it's very important also to kind of translate these estimates to a sense of how much crowding or activity there is. And we've tried to capture this in multiple places around the world. And so the American University of Beirut organized a stakeholder workshop in their campus to get all sorts of community stakeholders and interested parties to propose improvements in these blast-affected neighborhoods of Beirut. So this was the workshop. It resulted in many teams working on proposals of how to improve walkability in those blast-affected areas. And then the research team, after the workshop, basically collected these ideas and synthesized them into specific urban design scenarios. Scenario one was fairly tactical interventions of low-cost street improvements and traffic reductions. And these interventions were then visualized or kind of represented, and also, most importantly, represented in the pedestrian flow model as changes in either origins, destinations, or route characteristic. For instance, if there was a reduction in parking capacity on a street, that meant that the sidewalk grew larger and traffic volume decreased, which we could translate into an effect on friction. How much does the sidewalk improve in quality and attract more trips? And so through this, it was possible, and these are some of the other examples like intersection improvements that were proposed at the workshop. And through this, it was possible to then estimate the impact of that scenario before and after. So how much would these tactical changes that were proposed change pedestrian trip generation across different trip types and geographically shift pedestrian trips? So these blue lines here, so the gray lines represent current conditions, current volumes of foot traffic on the streets. And as a result of these proposals, the map on the right-hand side shows the estimated increase in foot traffic due to the improvements in scenario one, whether street-based or trip origins and destination changes. The blue means increase in trips. Red means also occasional estimated decrease in trips due to the shift of new destinations to different areas. So this went through a couple of different iterations. Scenario two contained fairly substantial urban design improvements that were no longer just tactical, but actually introduced full-scale public space improvements on certain streets. Interestingly, also the opening up of all green parks. So Beirut is not very green, as some of you may know, but even beyond that, the parks that it has have been locked since COVID, largely because they attract a lot of Syrian refugees, and the city has just kept them locked. And so we just estimated if you open them up to the public as public spaces, how much would that change in people's walking patterns throughout the city? And so we went through a kind of a similar estimation, like what would these particular changes produce in the model, and an illustration of how these particular park openings and more substantial urban design changes affect foot traffic. So as an example, on some streets, what used to be 200 people per hour, some of them with these substantial urban design improvements and amenity changes on the ground floor could go up to 800 people per hour. So it's very significant increase or large increase in foot traffic potentially. And then there was also a very kind of forward-looking, future-oriented scenario that many people looked at, which was the conversion of a highway, which is a Charles Hello highway, into a boulevard, and opening up of this area called Garantina, which is almost blends into the port of Beirut today, as a continuous grid where you can easily walk across this current day highway and have a Corniche Boulevard extension that goes past the port and opens up access to the seafront. So this was a much larger scale intervention. And again, the pedestrian flow model was used to illustrate or estimate how much that would change foot traffic geographically on different streets. And in these previous tables, also, what's the overall level of foot traffic change from current conditions, over 100% improvement or increase from the current conditions. So to conclude, pedestrian activity has all sorts of connotations in urban design and planning, from public health to social and economic questions, but oftentimes decarbonization seems to be one of these hooks that city governments currently care about the most, is how to create a modal shift to actually get people out of vehicles and into public transport and out as pedestrians. And therefore, it's important to actually try to document it and analyze how changes we implement today will impact the outcomes tomorrow. I would argue that unlike what the Smithsons said, that the charged void or the sidewalk ballet or the life between buildings is something we can only experience but can actually analyze, is not quite true. That we can actually try to analyze how urban design and architecture decisions of changing land uses and street qualities will result in changes in pedestrian behavior and foot traffic. It's important to do that so that we actually can move the needle towards more walking and more public transit use and actually result in mode share. This is something that traditionally traffic models do not do. None of the traffic models I'm aware of really take a close and detailed look at foot traffic. It's almost always exclusively vehicular traffic, sometimes vehicular traffic in combination with public transportation. And we've tried to do this in some other cities too, including Cambridge, Somerville, currently actually working on New York with Eric and some other partners from DOT to develop a citywide pedestrian flow model for New York City. And there's a new open source Python library coming out actually this fall. If any of you are interested in incorporating some of these models into your own work, then this makes it a whole lot easier than some of the previous tools we had. So thank you.
Yes, so, thank you. Very interesting work. Right, we don't have so many models looking to pedestrians as we have for vehicles. Now, from my perspective, one of course of the shortcomings of models is that they tend to equalize, say, the average pedestrian, right? And so I'm wondering if you have thought, or if it is the next stage of the research, if you look into particular groups. So for example, for women, it might be more important a combination of different goods along the way. It could be lighting, or it could be, a playground to take their kid. Or for retirees, maybe the jobs are not important, but the benches are more. So I'm wondering if you have thought of how to make it, to understand the particular combinations of amenities that attract particular groups of pedestrians, and how the improvements can, so that we go away from the average user.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you're absolutely right. So if you look at all the travel data that is officially collected with travel service, it tends to be, at least the data that's publicly available for researchers, tends to be the average citizen, right? Many people have noted that that's just not going to cut it. If you work in an ethnic neighborhood, if you walk in an elderly neighborhood, if you walk in an area with people with more cars or less cars, there's all sorts of factors that could affect that. I'm glad you asked the question today, actually, because if you take the subway in Boston, the red line and the green line and some of the orange line stations, you may notice big posters in the station which recruit participants to a study we're currently doing called Boston Walks. We're currently literally collecting data and recruiting participants by demographic bucket, where we have designated samples of gender difference, age difference, income difference, car ownership difference. And so we're in the middle of a study to specifically collect the data you're referring to have the route choice preferences modeled by different types of people. And we're also hopeful that New York City, who has very large travel service, will hopefully within the next couple of months release the data that they've been collecting that would allow us to do the same thing. So yes, incredibly important, and sort of in the process of trying to do that actually. I think Charlotte was.
Yes. Thank you so much for this great presentation, and I think it's really, I mean, it's a really important task to basically generate that data to place pedestrians on equal footing in terms of agency within these rooms. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, so you have listed this group of cities, and you mentioned there are governments which are interested. I'm curious about, and you mentioned Beirut, and those are governments with let's say, facing huge hurdles. And I wonder how much of what you produce here is able to find its way into governments that have, let's say, other fish to fry. To put it bluntly, let's say, how do you interact with this kind of situations?
I mean, to be honest, when this work started, we honestly also thought that the public sector has more of an active role when it comes to urban design and planning in Beirut. After being there and visiting, and also 2 years of collaboration with AUB colleagues, we learned that the public sector, the government, takes a very inactive role in all matters of planning in Lebanon. And in fact, a lot of change in built environments relies on charitable contributions from other countries or gifts from large organizations, including the French, that make investments into certain infrastructure in targeted ways. And NGOs are oftentimes the leaders of urban change. So entire streets and parks are transformed with small NGOs on the ground, with government just saying, okay, you can do it, but not taking any active role in facilitating or financing or any of it. And so it's a really interesting case that we learned that public sector really doesn't have that much of an active role. So our model has been to work very closely with the faculty at the American University of Beirut, who are incredibly connected in the city and who train the students, are linked with the NGOs, and carry the work forward, so that they have the know-how actually to use I mean, actually, most of the data we use in this model comes from them. They collect the data on the ground too, and they're kind of like the point organization for managing and heading it. But yeah, that's but beyond that, things vary in every country, right? So we're also very conscientious that some of these models may be perceived as fancy and data hungry, that only can be done in places like New York or Melbourne or Boston. And one of the reasons why we've particularly wanted to get engaged with Beirut is to try to see if they can be done in a totally different data context, and as an example that can be replicated in other settings. So collecting the data in itself was a huge effort in Lebanon, but I think it's very important that as these countries urbanize and oftentimes motorize, that they not be left off the boat, and sort of, we shouldn't start talking about pedestrian issues 30 years from now when it's far too late. That we try to find ways to engage now, even in very data poor contexts, to have some of these things in place. Yeah, David.
Thank you very much for the presentation. There's something very specific in there. Just put the slides saying alien city. So there is slopes.
Yes.
Wall city at slope of
Yes.
10%. Very different.
Sure.
Program that Springer, which
Mm-hmm.
parameter very often forgotten, but the fact
Yeah.
they're very different. I'm not going, maybe
Sure.
I'll go down, but I know that
Yeah.
to go up. It's important because we speak Cambridge, New York City, and Rome. It's where the car is already there, so we speak pedestrian relationship with this car. But in the megapolis, where informal neighborhood, people walk. They walk more and more difficult, especially the most poor. Favela, most of them are in Africa, Asia, they are on school. So, parameter.
Yeah.
It concerns a lot of people and just completely the way.
Yeah. I fully agree with you. I mean, the pedestrian route choice studies, what they're showing us is that walking 1 meter uphill adds for each walk, basically, or for each meter of elevation gain, 4 to 5 meters of perceived distance. So if you have to walk 10 meters uphill, that's as if the walk is 50 meters on top of what it really is. And it's a very penalizing thing. But those factors like elevation change can be incorporated in the route models as well. It's like the whole list of street attributes that changes your perception of travel cost. Topography is one of them.
People walk like this because it's flat.
Yeah.
And you have very less.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just 2 small words. The first one, how to use the word walkability. You're talking about pedestrian routes or other words. Is it because of something? I mean, or is it just that you haven't used it now? First question. And the second question is, it's not the same, in my opinion, if you choose a full pedestrian road that if you are talking about the last mile, for instance. I mean, a mixed trip using, for instance, car or bicycle or public transport, and then you reach your final destination by foot. In terms of, it doesn't apply probably the same rules, but they're not in the same part of the city, because normally that last mile is in the suburbs or maybe. Does your research make that difference or something?
Sure. Yeah. So on the question of walkability, I think what this model does not do well is represent things that are not trips and involve people in public space. So people sitting on a stoop and people watching, people just socializing on a street, people playing on the street. This is entirely missing from this model. This model is trips only. So pedestrian journeys by and large. And it's sometimes I feel we use confusing terms, like when we use, yesterday there was a mention of the walk score, as I think was in Anastasia's case, right? And people assign a lot of qualities to the walk score without really knowing what's under the hood, how walk score is being measured. Walk score is really just a measure of destination availability, destination accessibility, to be precise. But it's about how many restaurants, how many bus stops, how many schools are within a reasonable travel shed around you. It takes absolutely no toll of street quality. It's not part of how it's measured. And so I think it's sometimes good that we don't assign all of these qualities into a term if we don't do them. So if we talk about the overall concept of walkability, I think we have to actually try to do justice to put all of the components together, which we don't necessarily always do or can't do. On the question of the last, like that human behavior can differ if you're walking in center city versus if you're walking just the last mile from transit. That's absolutely true. And again, these a lot of these estimates for how people react to street qualities are based on travel surveys and route choice surveys. They oftentimes do distinguish. So if we only measure these effects for those trips that are part of transit, like walk from home to transit or transit to job or something like that, we can, and many people have done this, you get a slightly different coefficients that you can put in the model to represent the last mile behavior. And you can sort out also trips that are just fully walking trips. So that's entirely possible to sort out based on just filtering the data that you put into the analysis. So I think we're over time. I have to cut myself off. Sorry.